Watching the room populate, it's always quite fun.
It is, and like watching all the names. And
yeah, it's kind of like everyone coming into the bookstore. Everyone's wandering into the bookshop, but we can't linger in the aisles, unfortunately, and buy stuff on the way.
No, book launches are always so expensive.
Visiting bookshops, but it's a good thing. It's a good thing.
No regrets.
Yeah, no regrets. No, never. Not when book purchases are involved.
It's true.
Okay, guys, we might be good to go. So just to begin, I say good evening, everyone. Welcome to Kinnikunya's virtual YA evening with Garth Nix. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we're hosting this event from the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands from which you're all joining us this evening, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this event. I pay my respects to elders, past, present and emerging, and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the land and waters of Australia. So just to make sure you're all in the correct Zoom room, tonight we're here to learn all about the Left-Handed Booksellers of London from the extraordinary Garth Nix, who'll be chatting with the equally extraordinary Amie Kaufman. And if you have come to this Zoom chat tonight, I don't believe you need me to introduce either of them. Props, can you see that? Except to say, if there's any possibility that you missed it, Amie's latest book with Megan Spooner is the wonderful The Other Side of Sky. And if you haven't read Garth's Left-Handed Booksellers yet, the main, though I'm sure not only, topic of tonight's conversation, you're in for a super treat. So in your own socially distanced way, please welcome Garth and Amie.
Okay. Oh, thank you for having us, Alex. So I'm delighted to be doing this because I bloody loved this book. I know that you've all bought a copy to come and that some of you will have read it and some of you won't. So what I have done is put together a whole list of questions that will make you more excited to read the book if you haven't, and that will illuminate the book if you have, but that will not spoil you if you haven't read the book. So I'm delighted to get to ask Garth a bunch of questions. I'm going to do that until about sort of 7:10, and then I'm going to open up the floor to your questions. So if you have them, please do pop them in the chat, and I'll be fishing them out when we get to the end of the evening. So Garth, I have heaps of questions, but I feel like we should start with the one kind of most basic one, which is, we're in a slightly alternate London. It's 1983. Susan has come to the big city to go to art school and find her dad. But how do you like to describe the book? Do you have, you've done a lot of events by now. Have you hit the short description yet?
Oh, many times, and I have numerous short descriptions, and I always kick myself when I sort of forget one aspect of something I've used before. I think, oh, that worked pretty well, I should do that again. Yeah. I guess the first thing I could say is that the tagline at the very top of the book, authorized to kill and sell books, kind of sums it all up to a degree. It's a fantasy thriller. And it is set at a slightly alternate 1983 because I wanted a more diverse and gender equal 1983 than 1983 actually was.
Yep.
And I guess the other thing that's worth mentioning about it, it is a fantasy thriller. That's the sort of the form I wanted to tell this story. It's variously young adult or adult depending on where you're standing. It's published as adult in the United Kingdom and actually here, and YA in the United States. Once again, demonstrating the whole what is YA anyway.
No one knows anyway.
Question. You can call it a crossover book if you like, but I think it's suitable for good readers from teenagehood upwards. And I guess the other thing that I like to mention is that in many ways, there's a lot of things that went into this book. There's a lot of things that I drew upon going back through my whole life.
We're going to unpick a lot of them.
Get into that. But I guess at the sort of at the top level, I mean, on one level, it is a thriller, so it owes quite a lot to many thrillers on page and screen. But it also, perhaps even more fundamentally, is very much my attempt to write an older version of the kind of children's fantasy I particularly loved growing up, where you had a contemporary world and you had a mystical or mythic world which coexisted with the contemporary world, and the two intermingle. And so I wanted to take that. And of course, there's lots of books I could mention. Some of the chief ones would be Susan Cooper's The Dark is Rising, Alan Garner's The Weirdness of Brisingham, and there's others. I wanted to take that sensibility and put it into this fantasy thriller form. So that's a couple of things, I guess, that all you need to know is authorised to kill and sell books. Yeah.
Well, it's really interesting that you say that, because I'm going to jump to the question that I have about the echoes of those works, because I mean it's sort of a hallmark of what you do in different ways. It's always about what's abutting our own world, you know, whether it's sort of, you know, Mr. Monday and there's a portal to another world essentially that you can get to through ours, or whether it's, you know, something like the Old Kingdom series where there is a pretty good version of our world separated only by a wall from magic. And funnily enough, I had actually jotted down here that you and I have talked before about our love for Susan Cooper and The Dark is Rising, and that sense that if you could just catch a glimpse of it, there's something more that you could see. There's something. And
I think at different times we've all felt that there is more. I mean, classically, it's the sort of thing you feel very late at night or somewhere very remote, where you do feel the presence of another world. And sometimes it's very striking, and I do love that. I love that in fiction. You're right; it kind of is my stock in trade in different ways.
I feel like this is sort of the culmination of it, because this is the one I feel most like I have some kind of chance of slipping into out of all of them.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Well, it's the only one that has a sort of contemporary, setting for the main world. I mean, it's 1983. But it still is pretty close, you know, to us. Yeah.
So I want to ask you about Susan, who is our protagonist. So, you know, as I said before, for those who haven't read yet, we meet her as she's coming to London, and she's going to take up a place at art school soon. But her goal before that is to find out who her father is, because her mother either hasn't told her or hasn't been able to tell her. She's a little unclear, but her mother has not disclosed the identity.
She has a few clues, and that's it. Yeah.
And that's it. So she's ready to go. So the name Susan has a pretty decent history. You know, we've got, you know, Susan in Narnia. We've got Susan in Swallows and Amazons, of which I know you're a fan.
I'm a big fan.
And both of them were, you know, the practical one. And, you know, we go to Pratchett and we've got Susan, Death's daughter, who takes it all in stride and doesn't want any of your nonsense. And I mean, this Susan takes it pretty well in stride when it turns out that there's, you know, magic in a whole other world. And I was wondering, was it deliberate, the choice of name?
It's interesting because the answer is yes, but it was really my subconscious providing that. Like so many things, as I'm sure, you know, you do, so much of it's driven by instinct, and you write down a name and you think, oh yeah, that is the right name.
Yep.
And then you think, oh, and it's the right name because of all these connotations and resonance. But actually that wasn't what I was thinking when I just wrote down her name when she appeared. So yes, I mean, she owes a great deal. I mean, I do think Lewis named all of his children actually after the Swallows and Amazons children, though I've never seen anything canonical to suggest that's true. But you know, I think there's a lot of direct connections there between them, and the timing would work out for that. But yeah, my Susan probably owes more to the Susan of Swallows and Amazons than the Susan in Lewis's books. Though I always felt Susan was sadly shortchanged, of course, along with many other people. Absolutely ludicrous that she. You know, she couldn't go back to Narnia because of the fondness for lipstick and so on. But anyway, that aside,
that's a whole different book of
we should do. That's right. We should do that sometime.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. In the same way that Merlin, the left-handed bookseller, and his sister Vivian, you know, they're not Merlin and Vivian from the Arthurian tales. They're named after someone who had a fondness for those tales, but of course they also resonate in particular ways, and you have expectations from them. So there's names are always very interesting and tricky things. Typically, once I've named a character, I can't change it, even when I'm not super happy with it. I think I've gone and named them now, and I can't change it. Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's like naming your child. You've got a very small window in which it's acceptable to do it. And after that, I think you've really made the commitment.
Well, giving them two is not a bad idea, I guess, in case they
Got it
want to
back.
drop the first one, particularly if it's a little bit difficult. But yeah, I mean, I typically, I know very little about my characters when I start. I know very little about anything when I start, and I discover as I go along, I learn more about them. But I'm sure, of course, that by giving them particular names, you're already starting to shape their character because of all the ways it resonates with other people in fiction or real life.
Right.
Well.
So there's a good question. I wonder, did you sort of have an inkling she might be Susanish and so she became Susan, or did she become Susanish because you called her Susan?
Both, I guess.
Yeah.
But I think, yeah, both those things are true. It's all very mysterious. I mean, I often can't explain why I do things a particular way. I'm just happy when they work out. And sometimes other people have explained things to me as I must have been intending this, and I'm like, if it sounds good, I agree with them.
Sound very clever, so sure.
Yeah. And if it sounds kind of dumb, I'm like, no, I wasn't doing that. I was doing something else. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, you mentioned Merlin, and let's go to Merlin. Merlin is delightfully and casually gender fluid, and no one in the book gives a stuff about it. When we I don't want to get too far because I don't again want to spoil anyone, but he wears a dress as happily as he wears a suit. He discusses very early on that he's considering a different gender, and as I say, everyone's totally chill with it. So probably not something you would have encountered mainstream in 1983, which is, I guess, hence the alternate. How did you go about writing Merlin's gender and sort of making sure you got it right?
Well, it's interesting because, again, it stemmed from how he first appeared. I mean, I wrote the prologue, actually, I wrote later. So the first part I wrote was actually where Merlin appears and he disincorporates a crime boss with a silver hat pin.
He does.
And he's described in the first few paragraphs. And from those few paragraphs, I knew that he was very fashion conscious. He was very concerned about what he wore and how he looked, and that was part of his makeup. And again, I didn't know very much about him, but very early on, I mean, Susan doesn't know whether it says you couldn't be sure whether he was a young man or a young woman wearing a suit, wearing a men's suit. So Susan can't tell initially either. She's not sure. And that just seemed to be, that was his character. And then I thought, well, he is part of the booksellers, who are a clan who have magical powers, which are derived, they're mythical ancient powers. It would be quite reasonable for that to be a real thing where you couldn't be sure, because it would be his choice. He could be either.
Yeah. Or neither.
Or neither, which is actually something that was quite common in many old myths and legends too.
Yeah.
The gender swapping and transforming yourself into action, and not just across gender, but age and monster to human and so on. All of which I think is very appealing, to be able to change to be what you want to be, or what you need to be, depending on all kinds of circumstances. And Merlin himself, when Susan says to him, she wasn't sure whether he was a man or a woman, and he says, well, for the moment I'm a man. We're all a bit shapeshiftery, and I just love the idea of being a bit shapeshiftery, or quite a lot shapeshiftery. Actually, I think that would be. I guess it's like a lot of things in my books. I give the characters powers that I would like to actually exist. I invent places that I would like to exist as well, from bookshops in London to the Horson's house and the Old Kingdom books, or whatever, the Library of the Clare, or the house and the Keys to the Kingdom. All those things, I make them up because they're good for the story, but also at some level I would like them also to exist, to be real.
Right, and you, writing them into existence is the best.
Yeah, that's true. I am kind of making them real. If I do my job properly, I'm making them feel real. And so Merlin's ability to shift his gender according to what he wanted to be, I thought that would be a great thing. And why not have it? And it just totally fitted his character as well.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And I mean, also, you know, the social strictures we have around men wearing dresses, like men are ripped off. Dresses are great.
Yeah, for
Dresses
sure.
are comfortable.
Yeah. Or whatever you want to wear.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So, all right. So I want to turn to page 74.
Page 74.
We are in, and don't worry, I know this sounds a little far in, everyone. No spoilers, I promise. You're safe.
No spoilers, yes.
So we're in a bookshop and we're getting this gorgeous, luscious description of the bookshop with lots of great name drops.
Well, I should perhaps say that the booksellers whose primary job it is to police the old world, the mythic creatures and entities of the old world, and stop them interfering with the contemporary world, the new world. But they also have to make a living. So, and there's other reasons as well. They also run 2 bookshops. One, the new bookshop, which is in Mayfair, sells old books and collectibles, and the old bookshop sells new books. It's in Charing Cross Road. And yes, page 74, Susan and Merlin are visiting the old bookshop, which sells, they're visiting the new bookshop, which sells the old books. And Susan, I know where you're going with it. She's spied a whole lot of collectible.
She sees all these editions.
Children's books, yeah.
And she's looking up at the cabinet. Children's writers, said Merlin. Dangerous bunch. They cause us a lot of trouble. How? Asked Susan. They don't do it on purpose, said Merlin. But quite often they discover the key to raise some ancient myth or release something that should have stayed imprisoned, and they share that knowledge via their writing. Stories aren't always merely stories, you know. Come on. And I mean, this book is a love letter to books, amongst the many other things that it is. And I guess sort of question one is, how could you spill our secrets like that? But part two of the question is, I mean, if someone said to me, you know, choose which books are going to make it in, I would struggle. How did you go with it? How did you decide who got in?
Well, I initially wrote a much shorter list. I mean, some of the books that she spies are John Masefield's The Box of Delights, C.S. Lewis, Patricia Lynch's The Turf Cutter's Donkey, The Winter of Enchantment by Victoria Walker, Black Arts and Battersea by Joan Aiken, Rosemary Sutcliffe's historical novels, including Susan's favourite, The Silver Branch. It's kind of an equal favourite. I think she will probably have another favourite, which is Knight's Fee, which strangely enough are also my favourites. Diana Wynne Jones' Power of Three, The Winston of Risingham by Alan Garner, Five Children and It by E. Nesbitt, and many others. But yeah, when I first wrote that, I only did 2 or 3 books, and I kept going back and thinking, well, I just need to add one more. I mean, that could have been like 7 pages, which would have slowed the story down horrendously.
But cost all a lot of money in books added to our files.
But I'm very glad that I managed. I think it's probably one of the relatively few books where I managed to actually get in many of the books that influenced this book as part of the actual narrative of the book, not as an adjunct reading list. And one of the things I did with that is I put a couple of the more obscure books which people don't know in there, or don't tend to know so much now, like The Turf Cutter's Donkey, which is sadly not as well known as it should be, or The Winter of Enchantment by Victoria Walker, which was almost, for a long time, was basically impossible to get.
Right.
And the very few, like one secondhand copy a year would show up and would be sold for $1,000 because lots of children's fantasy writers like me were always buying them. But it has been republished since then, fortunately. So, so
your favourites crept in.
Some of my favourites, not all of them. Some of my favourites.
I mean, no, as you say, your favourites would just be, volume 2 books.
It'd be like your bookshelves behind you there, Amy. It goes stretching back. I'm envisaging that stretching back for 20 or 30 yards, 20 or 30 metres. There's a lot of
bookshelves in our house, although in private place.
Very good, very good.
But all right, so I want to keep talking about inspiration a bit. I know you speak in the acknowledgements of the book about meeting a left-handed bookseller to get things started off, and you speak about a fog that crept in your window, which is what we encounter in chapter 1. Is that sort of how it happens for you, sort of piece by piece, just sort of gathering little things? And
I think the sort of the imaginative fuel builds up over a very long time. So it has to be in my head for anything to happen. And in this case, you know, those authors I mentioned, that's part of the fuel. My time working as a bookseller is also part of it. Also, all the many, many hundreds, if not thousands, of bookshops I've visited as an author, also part of it. One of the reasons it's set in 1983, which various people have asked about, is because that's when I first went to the United Kingdom, and I spent a long time there. And so that year, it's very clear. Well, it's very clear in my mind. You put your finger on it.
My question was, apart from the amazing fashion and the general lack of mobile phones, why 1983? But because,
well, you know, I didn't even think about the lack of mobile phones. Though, of course, if you're writing a thriller, the absence of
if
both,
they can clearly communicate.
And also the absence of Google is very useful, or the internet actually at all is very useful.
But it's also that you have a version of London from 1983.
Yeah, but also it was it's not just that, it was also a very important year for me, because that was the year I decided I wanted to be a writer as well. Okay. Even though I knew that I would have to do other things, because I'd read a lot about writers' lives, and I knew that economically, not only was it essential to have a day job, the better the day job, actually the easier it is often. So I'd already decided I would go back. When I went back to Australia, I'd go to university so I could get a better graded day job. But I also knew that I wanted to be a writer. And that realization came to me as I was traveling around the United Kingdom, and I'd bought this terrible old Austin 1600, which was an old car even then. And it literally was quite a bad car. I mean, the wheel fell off once, it caught a light once, which I discussed with Maggie, of course.
It was, sorry?
It caught a light once, not severely, it just burned oil underneath the bonnet.
I feel like I don't know, as I know you didn't have it with Maggie, who's an expert. I don't know a lot about cars, but
Maggie has had cars catch light, and has made other people's cars catch a light, racing them, and she's an expert in this area. Anyway,
to me, like, even a little bit on fire is too much on fire.
I was 19. All this smoke came out from under the bonnet. I opened the bonnet. The smoke eventually stopped, and I realised that it was the oil underneath that, sort of caked under the bonnet. And then it stopped. So I shut the bonnet and I continued on my way.
I mean, as I'm saying this, I'm reflecting that when I was 19, I used to have a car that would overheat, and the top would pop off the radiator, and hot water would come, like boiling water would come straight from the sides of the bonnet. And in through my driver's window, because I had no air cons, the driver's window would be open. And so you'd be driving, and suddenly, like, boiling water would just...
And your car would cease.
And I just thought this was, like, quite, half of the course. So I guess, you and I...
It's absolutely the same principle. And when the wheel fell off, I was driving quite slowly. So, I mean, my first thought was someone's wheel's fallen off, before I realised it was actually my own car. But that's not important right now.
Entertaining, though.
Entertaining. But so I was driving around, and I was rereading many of my favourite children's books, particularly children's books, but others as well, in the places where they were set. So I read The Weird Son of Brisingamen in Cheshire. I climbed Alderley Edge and so on. So my car, the boot was full of books and a typewriter, because I bought it, this is 1983.
And you were going to be a writer, so...
when I decided I was going to be a writer. And in fact, the first story I sold, I typed on that typewriter. Sadly, I had to sell it, because when I eventually got back to London, I had a ticket home, but I didn't have enough money to get the bus to Heathrow. So I had to take my typewriter to a pawnbroker and sell it, which is sad. Anyway.
Well, it's a good trip, though.
Yeah, it was a good trip. And I also wrote half a novel, because I had not yet learned the importance of finishing things, because half a novel, of course, can't get you anywhere. When you finish something, there's possibility. You've created the possibility of something to happen. And it wasn't I've looked at it a few times over the years. It wasn't absolutely terrible. I mean, it wasn't very good, but it wasn't absolutely terrible. Maybe I could have fixed it up. Anyway, and so 1983, very significant year for me. Also a time I knew England well. But many of the books that influenced Left-Handed Booksellers of London were ones that I read. At that time, I read Susan Cooper in Hampshire, and there were quite a few places I visited that felt like they were Dark is Rising kind of settings. So it was such a big influence. It just felt right to set it in 1983. And as soon as I decided it was 1983, there was really no going back. I did toy briefly with making it totally contemporary, but then I thought, there's no point, you know. Yeah.
I mean, it's, yeah, I could put my finger on it, I think, if I thought for long enough about why, but it would not be the same book at all if it was completely contemporary.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, you could find a plot way around this.
Yeah, it needed to be in 1983. Yeah, that's true. It's just, and it felt right. I mean, so often these decisions are instinctive, and you don't really know why you've made that decision, but that's how it works out. So, yeah.
It does. Well, and I often think when we try to dig too deep, you know, it reminds you of the one about the centipede, and someone says, how on earth do you walk with 100 legs moving all at once?
And once they start thinking about it, of course, everything stops.
Yeah, never think too hard, right? So to stick with a little with 1983, the fashion in the book is unbelievable. And I mean, you know, I've often remarked upon your keen interest in the world of fashion. It's something you're known for amongst writers, but it's not something you're known for amongst writers, Garth. And the fashion in this is amazing. Like whether it's, you know, Merlin rocking a dress and Susan getting, like, frankly, really cross that somehow, you know, she looks like a drowned rat and he just looks like he meant to get wet.
Yeah, we all have friends who are like that.
We all have friends like that.
We all have at least one friend who doesn't matter. They could go through a hurricane, or they could be half drowned, or whatever. They will still look fantastic, and
they come out of
rags, or they have to borrow clothes because of some incident, and the clothes they borrow are a child's terry toweling jumpsuit made large. It will still look great on them. Everyone knows someone like that. I'm not someone like that at all.
No,
I'm as far removed as possible. But
I class them with the people who look good while they're crying.
Yeah,
you know, everyone knows one or two people who can cry attractively.
I think it's the same people. Yeah, it's the same people, I'm sure. It's just an inbuilt thing, and Merlin certainly would be one of them. You know, it's another ability, I guess. And
sure, again, one.
But I think more seriously with clothes, they are part of the small details that you use to make the story real.
Right, and then that's what I want to get into, because everyone's outfit gets a moment, you know, whether it's Merlin looking fabulous or whether it's, you know, bookseller matriarch in fishing vest and tattoos, you know, scoffing Jaffa cakes like a champion. But I think it really does plant you in the world, and I'm sort of imagining you selecting these outfits, and I'm wondering if you can say a bit more about how did you go about dressing them all?
Well, it's an interesting question, because I think, again, it all came kind of just from their character, but also from trying to remember what people wore back in 1983. So it's observation, I guess. And then I did also look at, now one of the things that was very enjoyable for writing this book was revisiting some of my favourite TV shows and films from that era, just to remind me of what the early 80s was like, particularly in the UK.
Yeah.
And then, of course, I also... many of them I gender swapped to be in the book as well, like The Professionals, which I loved. It was a very sexist show. I mean, and as soon as I thought in this world it would actually be two women playing the main roles, and I thought, wouldn't that be a great show? And then I thought, well, they should make it now in my alternate 1980s, but with all the cast gender swapped. It'd be great. But thinking about what they wore in those shows and in those films. And I also looked at, documentary footage as well. This is a sort of idle research that I do. I watched the first season of Minder for the first time in 25 years or whatever.
How'd it go?
It's interesting. I mean, I enjoyed it. I mean, it's a very well made show, and it was super popular. I remember when I was, I guess, in my late teens, early 20s, and you can see why. But one of the things I wanted to watch it for was to remind myself, actually, of some of the sort of grime and grottiness of London, parts of London and United Kingdom. But it was quite a bit sort of more raw back then in many ways. So of course, it depends where you're going to, and also just, again, small details. And I had to look up various things, but a lot of the clothes just seem to, I think I'd think of something, I'd think, oh, I wonder if that was around in the back then, or if I can make it work if it wasn't. And then it just seemed right for the character. So I guess it's informed instinct again. If you've done the research or perhaps lived through it, but you don't have to. I'm always hasten to add, people say, could you write this if you'd never been to London? Well, yes, you could, but it would be more difficult, but it's totally possible.
Yeah.
I always like to cite Patrick O'Brien of Master and Commander fame, who was not a sailor. I mean, these are possibly the best, the best stories of the Napoleonic era of sail ever written.
Right. And I mean, speaking as someone who is a sailor and who I literally took my first steps on a boat and grew up on a boat, and those things are read by sailors and loved by sailors, most of whom I think if you told them the author was not a sailor would just laugh at you. Yeah, absolutely. I was astounded when I read that he'd been possibly out in a boat 2 or 3 times, and he was not a regular sailor at all. But he was a very, very careful researcher of contemporary accounts of that time, and just had the kind of mind that could put it all together, which is, yes, you can do it, but it is so much harder work. But a combination of the two is good, where you have some of the lived experience, and you also can pull everything else from Google Earth or whatever it takes. Yeah, absolutely. Which I did. Even parts of London I know quite well. I double checked. I looked at them again in various ways, because even though this is an alternate London, an alternate England, and there's other parts of England that are important too, I still wanted to make the things that could be that are real. I wanted to make sure I got those real to give me room in the edges for the things that were not, because that helps make it all work. Yeah, it helps make fantasy work. Yeah, absolutely. You want your deviations to be on purpose rather than accidental. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. All right. So for our audience, I have a couple more questions, and then I'm going to turn over to your questions. So please pop them in the comments if you've got them. If you're not a regular Zoomer, if you look across the bottom of your Zoom screen, you will see, you might need to run your mouse there, but you'll see various icons, one of which says chat, and that's where you can click if you'd like to add in a question. So one thing I always like to ask authors when I'm looking back on their books is there a bit in it that you're particularly proud of, or that you think you pulled off particularly well, or just, that you nod in quiet satisfaction to yourself about? It's a good question, because people sometimes ask, what's my favorite book of those I've written? And of course, there's not one, because every book has parts of it that I think have totally worked, and other parts that have not worked as well. Even though I'm proud of all my books and I think they overall work extremely well, there's always parts that I would have liked to have been better. And I guess it's because in the imagining, the stories are always so great, and then you write them and you can never quite capture what's in your head. I mean, but then that drives us on, doesn't it, to try again. And next time, belief that the next one will be. Next time we'll get closer. I think we all. I mean, if we do start thinking that the book is perfect, I think that's very dangerous. No, I mean, that's a lack of insight, not a pinnacle of achievement. I think so. So I hope that never happens to either of us, for that matter. But no, there's no particular sequences or parts of the book that I'm particularly, I do sort of chortle to myself, but there's lots and lots of, but there are many, many little things where I was pleased to get them in, but there's actually lots and lots of them, and I hope all together they work. So, and it's not just the references to books. There's little tips of the hat to various authors, which, without actually mentioning the titles or the authors' names. And so, I mean, there's a cow creamer as a little P.G. Woodhouse joke. Yeah. Things like that. I mean, which you don't need to appreciate that at all. It doesn't matter, but hopefully it's another little additional thing. And I think, of course, you've got to be careful with that kind of stuff too, because sometimes you don't want it to be so clever you're laughing at it, but it takes away from the story or takes you out of the story. So you don't want that to happen either. Yeah. Well, and that feeling that the reader can have, that they know that there's something they're not getting.
Yeah. I don't want that either. The sort of the private nudge joke you're excluded from.
Right.
So this.
Hundreds of Easter eggs, though, kind of mean that everyone who reads the book has a slightly bespoke
Yeah,
experience.
I hope so. Yeah, and gets different things. And you don't need to know about early 80s British pop culture, but there's lots of stuff in there, which if you like it, you get it, but you don't need to know it. I mean, you can look it up if you want, or not. It doesn't actually matter. The story, I hope, carries you on, and you think, oh, okay, and off you go. But then if you want to, you can explore further. So, but I guess like all my books, when they're done to me. Once they're out in the world, I don't think about what I could have done differently, because it's too late. It's already out there. And it's a bit like a grown child, I guess. They have become an adult and they're forging their own path, and that's you have to you support them as best you can and hope for the best. But I'm always looking ahead to what I'm doing now or what's next. And I'm not a I'd like to do an authorized director's cut of one of my old books type person. I always find it very strange when people do that. Though there are circumstances where you might want to, and I do understand that if there's been enormous interference, for example, in a book, I could understand why you might want to do a different version, but I've not had that. So to me, the books are what they are.
Yeah, I like that. And I agree. I think once they're out, they're out. And funny you should say you like to think about what happens, what you're doing right now and what's next, because that was actually going to be my final question.
Very good.
Is what is next from the House of Nix?
The House of Nix. What should be next, and hopefully will be next, is another Old Kingdom novel called Terseal and Eleanor. Terseal is Sabriel's father. It doesn't take too much of a leap to work out that Eleanor is her mother. So all being well, it'll be out this time next year, but I should have already finished it and I haven't.
Said every author attempting to write a book in 2020.
I think that's true, and I'm doing a very major rewrite, which I think is also quite common in this particular year. So that will be next, but it may or may not be this time next year. It might be somewhat later, but we'll see. I'm actually happy with how my reimagining and rewriting of it's going, but since I haven't actually delivered it yet, I don't want to promise anything, because you never know.
Garth, I have been quoting you in conversation to a lot of writers recently who are all running late, because it turns out existential dread's not great for creativity. Who knew?
Yeah.
Over and over when you said to me, better the right book late than a bad book on time.
Yeah. And I do very much believe that. Yes. Yeah. Of course, a good book on time is the best.
Book is the dream. But
it's the dream.
If we have to choose one. And, I always remind myself, I don't get to put out the book with a little asterisk beside the title and they turn it over and down the bottom on the back cover it says, this would have been really great if my editor would have given me 2 more months. But, this is what you got. Once it's out, it's out.
Yeah.
All right. So I'm going to head across to some of the audience questions. We have one from Indy, who works at one of my favourite bookshops in Victoria. Hi, Indy. Who says, as a right-handed bookseller, I loved reading this so much. And I was wondering if you had any future plans or ideas of more stories set in this world or more adventures from Susan and Merlin. I also wondered this, but decided I would leave it for Indy's question when I saw it there. Even a short story will do, Garth.
There is already a short story, which is in the Waterstones special edition, because the British chains in particular always want bonus content, and they are massive creatures, so one has to do so. But I will make that available at some point down the track, so that's more widely available. So it's actually set about 4 years before this book, and doesn't have Merlin and Vivian in it, but it is a Left-Handed Booksellers short. I have notes for another book and a title. So probably it's quite strong in my mind, but I'm not sure when it will happen. There's always books queuing up to be written, and typically what happens is that one of them jostles to the front, and demands to be written, and that becomes the next thing. So after Terseal and Eleanor is finished, I've got a number of different things to decide what to do. So, I mean, I've got a follow-up to Frog Kisser as well planned.
Also very acceptable as an option.
Yeah, I hope so. And some completely unrelated to anything else books as well. So who knows? But yes, there are definitely, I have notes, and there may well be more in the world of the left-handed booksellers and the right-handed booksellers and the even-handed booksellers, because they're all very important in the
it's an ecosystem.
Yeah, I should actually probably say, I mean, the left-handed booksellers are, the field agents. The right-handed booksellers are the controllers and researchers. And then the few even-handed have the powers of both. But they're all very, very important in the work of policing the old world and keeping those dread entities under control.
Yeah. All right. So Amelia has a bunch of questions. So Amelia, I'm going to do a couple of yours, and then I'm going to do some others. And then if we have time, I'll come back just to make sure I spread my love around. But one that I think a lot of people will be interested in is, she says, you regularly release new books, which is pretty amazing. Agreed. How many hours a day would you say you dedicate to writing? So what does your schedule look like?
Yeah, I mean, it varies.
Probably not in 2020, just generally. What is it?
Yeah, generally speaking. And it's changed a lot over time too, because I wrote many of my earlier books while I had very busy day jobs. So I was working full time a lot, as a bookseller, and then lots of different jobs in publishing, and then in marketing and PR for IT companies, and then back in publishing again as an agent, all very busy jobs. And I used to write a couple of nights a week. So 2 or 3 hours, a couple of nights a week, Tuesday, Thursday, say. And then I'd try and work every Sunday afternoon. And most Sundays I'd write for 4 or 5 hours. And if you just do that consistently, in a year or a year and a half, you can write a book. And then about 20 years ago, I became a full-time writer properly, and I sort of reversed that. And I write during the day. I probably only write 2 or 3 hours, actively write maybe between 2 and 4 hours during the day. And a lot of that's revision. It's not new writing necessarily. And I spend the sort of other office hours doing all the sort of admin and so on you need to do, because, you're a small business. If your books are published widely in lots of different places, there's always that business stuff to do, and then it's little promotional.
You're asking some question, or
yeah, exactly.
Just do this quick interview, and you're like, it's the 27 others.
Yeah, answer these 10 questions. Do this video, all of which helps the book, so it's a good thing. But it does certainly add up. And then I will write, and typically what I do is I revise whatever I wrote the last time I was in front of the computer. I can't say sitting in front of my computer because I mostly stand, as I am now, at my standing desk. And then I forge ahead into the new writing. I often work for a few hours at night as well, particularly towards the end of a book, when the momentum is gathering and the energy is increasing.
Downhill suddenly.
Yeah, downhill, exactly. I will start doing a few hours, more than a few hours at night. I'll be doing 3 or 4 hours at night. And I'll do that every night until the book is done. But it's always revising and writing. I don't just write and then revise a huge lot. I revise as I go. And so I'm always doing both at once. But I think it's important, to always mention that every writer is different. People do things in very different ways. So how I work and my routine is not something that might work for another writer. So it's always good. It's always interesting. I mean, we all love hearing how each other works, how other writers work. But, some people begin at the end and go backwards and divide things up in different ways. There's so many different ways to write. So yeah, that's kind of mostly how I do it. But I always advise trying different things and different routines. I think it's good to have a routine, whatever it is, and that's always helpful.
I mean, I think we all love hearing each other talk about how we do it, because we're all hoping that, even though we know better, that, someone will say, oh, I do it this way. And you'll go, oh, that is the golden way. Now I know how.
Well, and sometimes you think, I'll give that a try, and you never know. And particularly, I think early on, when you are trying different things, and then you hear someone say, this is how I do it, and you try it, and it's like, oh yeah, this is the way to do it. That's super helpful. But sometimes you get authors who say, this is how you write a novel, as if it's like the only way. And I was, you've got to be wary of writing advice.
Yeah, I mean, I think the way that you write a novel is you assemble a toolbox of lots of different techniques. And the more you've thought about them, the more you can kind of consciously employ them. So if you're having a tough time, you can think, oh, maybe I'll try that thing Garth said, or maybe I'll try that thing that I heard. But there's no one, I mean, there's not even one way for established writers.
No, because it might change from book to book. Yeah.
That was the great heartbreaking lesson for me, the realization that I was never going to have nailed writing books, because every time I do, it's slightly different.
Well, I forgot someone said, you never know how to write a novel. You only know how you wrote your last one.
Yeah, it's true.
So it's always a voyage of discovery, but maybe that's a good thing too.
Yeah. I mean, it keeps us on our toes.
Yeah.
So Zarabeth asks, as huge fans of the Old Kingdom series, our family would like to know what the inspiration was for the river.
Well, the River of Death, I guess the basic inspiration came from when I was looking at various beliefs about death and the afterlife and so on. And there is the classical rivers of death, the Styx and the Lethe and so on. And you cross those in Greek legend and myth. And I thought, you have a ferryman, it takes you across. I actually thought that's an interesting border you're taken across, but it doesn't actually give you a lot of scope to tell a continuing story. It would be better for narrative purposes if you went along the River of Death. And then as soon as I started thinking about the need to go along the River of Death, I thought, well, you still need to be crossing boundaries or for things to change. And then I thought about the gates. So that's pretty much where that came from, except that is the answer I've worked out after years of people asking me this question. I'm not sure if you'd asked me while I was writing the book, I would not necessarily have been able to tell you that, but I'm pretty sure that's where it came from. But I guess the bigger answer is it came from the fact that I was thinking about death. I was thinking about what various cultures have believed happens to you when you die, and also how you can come back to life. And again, the Greek myths there are useful, but there's various other myths and legends and stories. I mean, many fairy stories about coming back from death and the consequences of that. So it was all of those things, fed into that. But I think I think the Styx and the Lethe and so on are very much probably the obvious influence and the correct one in this case.
Well, I'm glad to hear that that's your kind of polished in retrospect answer, because as you were giving it at first, I was just thinking, well, that's why he's Garth Nix and we're the rest of us, because no one else sits there and thinks, I know, wait. But you kind of do, just never that coherently until later.
Yeah, well, often you never had to think about it till someone asks, and then it's like, oh yeah, hang on a second.
No, it's the vibe, Your Honour.
Yeah, it's the vibe. Yeah, exactly.
All right. So Alyssa asks, in keeping with the theme of the book, this is a tricky one. What are your top 3 favourite bookshops in Australia? I mean, it's kind of like asking, what 3 body parts do you want to keep and we'll get rid of them. But I'd say not your top 3, because I think that's an unfair question, but if you don't mind me editing it, Alyssa. But what are some of your favourite?
Well, I love Kinokuniya.
Right.
Because it's huge and it has such an enormous range. It has tremendous YA and children's. It has, fantastic graphic novels, manga.
And the very first time I ever came in, some legend called Phil tried to hand sell me my own book, not knowing who it was. But I was like, this is the place.
Well, there you go. You see, that's exactly.
Great taste.
But also fantastic. It's nonfiction is tremendous as well. And of course, the super friendly, lovely staff, which is always what makes such a big difference. I mean, you could have a very small bookshop that has not much stock, but if it has a very friendly, caring bookseller, that makes all the difference. There's so many actually. I mean, I've almost never walked into a bookshop I didn't like, even if it was not a very good bookshop.
Right, there's always something you can get.
There's always something, even when there's people who don't really want to be there, working there, which does happen sometimes, bizarrely, believe it or not. And the people behind it just want to move stock and don't care about books as books. It's just
You're still
units to
surrounded
be
by
sold. But there's still books. So yeah, I love bookshops of all kinds, and I just wish there were more of them. I mean, that's my closest bookstore is Harry Hartog in Bondi Junction, which is a really nice store. It's a good store, and I buy books there. I buy books in Kinnicoonia. Often, kind of secretly, I have to slip in. I don't know. If I'm not in a bookshop appearing as an author, I always get embarrassed if I'm actually recognized. I'm not quite sure what that says about me. I want to be I just want to be a customer. So I'm not one of those authors who wants to sign whatever their books are there or anything like that.
You're not standing there checking out your book, holding it up
or moving it
on the back in your face.
No, or moving them all face out or any of that stuff. I just like to. I'm not quite sure what it says. I mean, maybe it's.
I suspect it says that you are still also a reader, and that sometimes.
Yeah, I'm primarily a reader. And when I'm in a bookstore, that's what I want to be too. So of course I'm always pleased to see my books, but I don't stand in front of them going, any of that stuff. But yeah, it's if I'm not there to be an author, I like to be there as a reader, and I love buying books in person. I love walking to a bookstore, possibly with the aim of getting a particular book and walking out with 10 others, because of the accidental discovery of things you didn't know about, or you didn't know were out yet, or had never ever heard of. But gosh, that looks interesting. I'll have that.
Yeah, I mean, at my local bookshop, they know I wander in now, and they used to say, "Are you after something?" And now they just wave. They know the answer's never that I'm after something. It's always just I'm just going to walk the shelves till something falls to me.
Yeah, I'm in a very fortunate position as well, because I get sent a lot of books. And of course, my wife is a publisher, so she has lots of books. And so we have a sort of constant stream of incoming books anyway, as well as the ones that I buy. But I do love the accidental discovery, just from wandering around the aisles and seeing things you didn't know existed, or you did know existed but had forgotten about. Books that have been reprinted that you loved 30 years ago and haven't seen in that time, and all that stuff. And secondhand bookstores I love too, of course, because again, the discovery element there is very high.
Yeah, I bring home the most ridiculous things. In the before times, I bought home this huge hardcover that was some guy's travel writing from the late 1800s. And I just flipped it over. There was a hilarious description of him being chased by a bull. And I was like, yep, I'm in. Take this baby.
I'll have that. Yeah, me too.
It's like a phone book. And my husband's like, we've been posted like 30 books this week. What has this been? He's used to it.
Books come in, books go out. It's a tide. The tide of books ebbs and flows. It mostly flows, to be honest, but that's good. Mostly it's inwards, but...
we just build more bookshelves and keep going. Yeah. Or in one notable occasion for us, quite literally moved house to get more bookshelves. But,
that's my next plan.
You do what it takes, Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
I want to reunite all my books in storage, because I have 120 boxes of books in the storage unit. So, well, it's probably 140 or 50 now, actually, to be honest.
Garth, I've seen your house. There is not room for 140 boxes.
No, that's why the moving is the next goal. The creation of it's going to have a barn or a giant shed or something to put all the books in. But anyway, these are life goals. We should get back to the questions.
We should. Well, we've got time for one more. So let me, and apologies to everyone whose questions we didn't get to. There are a lot of you. But perhaps we'll end with, I had it a second ago, Sabella's question, which I think you can probably apply across all of your books, which is, how do you make sure that the lore and magic in your stories are consistent throughout the novels? And the question was in particular about the Old Kingdom books, but I think even, you mentioned that you've got a whole set of notes for the inevitable sequel. And obviously you don't, as we said earlier, you want the contradictions to be on purpose. So how do you track that stuff?
Well, I mostly just keep it in my head, but I do have to remind myself of things. So particularly for the Old Kingdom books, for example, Sabriel came out in 1995. I wrote it between 1993 and 1994. So it's a long time ago. So I actually have to reread my own novels to remind myself of various details, many of which I'm quite pleased to rediscover when I read them, except for I don't particularly like rereading my own work. It's the only time I reread my own books is when I have to do so for purposes of continuing in the same world. But mostly it stays in my head. I don't have a sort of codex or which many authors do, very sensibly, in fact.
Very sensible authors.
Very sensible authors. Yeah.
I just have like, it's all in here or in old notebooks in a pile somewhere, and it's a disaster.
Well, mine are all in old notebooks as well, but you could never find the entries. In fact, I mean, and the other thing which is very useful to me is, in fact, the Wikipedia entries that other people have written about my books. And in fact, when the Keys to the Kingdom, which is being developed as a TV series, when that was happening, I had to go to the Keys to the Kingdom Wikipedia entry to remind myself of some of the secondary characters. And I still had to reread the books as well. So I'm very grateful when people do lots of work and distill from my books lots of useful information. Every now and again, there's something wrong with it, of course, which is a problem.
Username Nix92 in there.
It's like that's not in the book. Hang on, what's going on here? Then someone's gone off a bit there and is extrapolating something that's not in the books. So in my head, and I have to remind myself by reading my own work, reluctantly but necessarily. Yeah.
I mean, I'm not saying I did look up details in the online Aurora Cycle yesterday, trying to remember something for book 3, but I'm not saying I didn't. It's like, bless you, readers. Thank you. I knew that list would be somewhere, but this is much easier.
Yes, very helpful, and I'm very grateful.
Well, I mean, we're sort of at time, but Garth hates it when I say nice things about his books, but
no, I don't.
I know brace then. I mean, the thing is, I know I don't have to sell this to all of you because you've bought a copy, which is why you're here, but I don't think we can wrap up without me just saying, I just bloody loved this book, Garth. I really did. It was the first time in 2020 that I really feel like I have just dived into something and not come out. And you know, it nailed the thriller aspect, but it also just genuinely felt like a romp. And marrying those two things is, you know, incredibly hard to do, as I assume you discovered during the process. I don't know, maybe it just flowed, but it really is. And it's just absolutely full of characters I fell in love with and little touches I fell in love with. And it feels like I've read 10 books in a series. I'm so familiar with the world, with everyone and every part of it. It feels so rich. And the fact that you've managed to do that without just giving us pages and pages of exposition is, I mean, I guess why, as I was saying earlier, you're Garth Nix and the rest of us are the rest of us. But congratulations. I thought it was absolutely
Well, thank you,
wonderful.
Amy. That's very high praise. So thank you very much from a writer who is absolutely my equal in all counts. So I don't know why. Don't put yourself down to raise me up, because we're certainly all in the same family tree, I think.
That's very kind, but I don't take it as any insult to me at all to say that in our Aussie YA family we've got Garth at the top. I think all readers would.
It's very kind. I don't think it's true, but it's very kind of you. But I'm really pleased that Left-Handed Booksellers of London connected, and to say that, you know, you were lost in this year, I think is very high praise. So I've been trying to lose myself in all kinds of books, often successfully. So
escaping takes some doing right now.
Yeah. So thank you again.
No worries. And a huge thank you to all of you for coming, and to Alex and to Kino for having us as well.
Thank you guys. It was amazing.
Just a delight as a Melburnian to see your faces. I don't see a lot of them right now.
No.
She's laughing.
Thanks so much for hosting, Amy.
Pleasure, as always.
Yeah, and best of luck, and hope you get out of lockdown pretty quickly.
Oh, don't we all?
Or soon.
Don't we all?
Yeah.
We'll get there. And in the meantime, I've got books. So, you know.
Could be worse.
Yeah. Could be worse. All right. Is there anything we need to do before we wrap up, Alex, or are we?
No. Thanks, everyone, for coming. Thank you, Garth, for such an entertaining discussion and for such an awesome book.
Thank you.
Yeah, good luck with everything. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone, for coming.
Thanks, everyone.
Hope to see you all in the flesh soon.
I hope so.
Yeah. Thanks.